you're joining us on Radio Scotland or on BBC One this morning. Thanks for being with us. Good as ever to have you along. Now then, we might just be a couple of weeks into the new year, but we've picked up where we left off, haven't we? Events already moving along at that familiar breakneck speed. No doubt you'll have your thoughts, and we want you to share them with us this morning, whatever issue it is. Do get in touch with us over social media. BBC Sunday Show is the hashtag. Right, first up this morning, when the Supreme Court ruled last year that Scotland needed Westminster's permission if it was to hold an independence referendum, Nicola Sturgeon announced her government would be taking a different tack. She said they'd use the next general election as a de facto referendum and settle the issue that way. It's proved controversial, with her own party members asking how the whole thing's going to work and whether it was all maybe just a bit too risky. Well, they're going to nail down the details at a special conference in March, and yesterday the party confirmed the options that are going to be up for debate. Members can either vote to take the fight to the country as planned at the next Westminster election, or they could choose to wait until the next Holyrood elections in 2026. No option as it stands to opt for anything else. Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to the party's new leader at Westminster, Flynn, and asked him which option he preferred.
Well, of course, like all my colleagues, I've been considering this matter over many weeks and many months. And I've very much come to the conclusion, as things stand, that a Westminster general election is the best option for us. And I'll explain why, if that's okay. And it's primarily focused on hope. We need to offer the people of Scotland, sooner rather than later, the opportunity to do things better and to do things differently. We know going into that next general election, the Conservatives are going to be led in all likelihood by either Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson if he does make a comeback. But we know the damage they've done over the course of the last 13 years. The UK economy is expected to be in the longest and deepest recession of all G7 nations. This coming year, we know that inflation is at a 40-year high. We know that interest rates are at levels last seen in the early 2000s, as indeed our wages, sadly. We know the damage they've caused, and the alternative for us at the moment, or which is put forward to us, is for Keir Starmer to become Prime Minister. But when it comes to the big issues of the day, when it comes to the membership of the single market and customs union, when it comes to freedom of movement, when it comes to Scotland's right to democratically choose its future, Keir Starmer is very much in line with the Conservative Party. So I believe that it's incumbent upon us to go into that general election to say to the Scottish people, we can offer you something different, we can offer you something better, we can offer you a little bit of hope, and let's go from there. OK, so why offer the option of delaying it another couple of years till 2026? Because there's obviously a broad range of views within the party and indeed within the independence movement as to what comes next. And I think it's healthy for any political party to have a democratic debate, which we will do, about where we intend to go in relation to our next steps in relation to independence. Have you heard many members saying, let's wait, let's kick it down the road for a couple of years? I mean, if anything, there are members saying, let's go sooner, let's collapse Holyrood now and go now. Well, I don't think collapsing Holyrood is a reasonable position to take, and obviously there would be huge consequences to that, which have been outlined by many of my colleagues. I think where the discussion has been is whether the franchise which sits in relation to the Holyrood election would be preferential to the franchise for a Westminster election. What, because you get 16 to 18-year-olds voting? Younger people voting, foreign nationals being able to vote. I think there's obviously an understanding there that electorally that may well, and there's no presumptions being made here, of course, that may well be something which helps the independence movement. But I think we need to reflect when we're having this discussion on the fact that we even need to do this. The people of Scotland voted for a majority of members of the Scottish Parliament in favour, who are, of course, in favour of a second independence referendum. The UK government has said that they're not going to respect that mandate which is replicating the mandate that came in previous elections as well. The UK Supreme Court says that we have no other way to determine our own future through a democratic referendum. Sure. So we have to go through this rule, which I think is very unfortunate. When this was all laid out first in June, the First Minister was all blood and thunder. She came out and said, if the Supreme Court rule against us, we go. De facto referendum at the Westminster election, game on. It feels like the air's coming out the balloon a bit now, doesn't it? If you're saying, well, hang on a second, we can wait a couple of years, let's see what happens, maybe the gradualists can have their say and, well, whatever. It just feels like this is deflating fairly rapidly, doesn't it? Well, I don't think that's a fair reflection. I actually think it's a good thing. Conversely, I think if the First Minister or the Scottish National Party's NEC had gone to conference with one position, then we'd probably be getting criticised for not allowing members the opportunity to debate. But we've sought to to grasp the thistle a little bit, for want of a better phrase, to let members have their say. And I think that's a good and healthy debate to have. I've made my views clear. I know that some colleagues have got different views, but I respect their views, and I'm looking forward to having that positive discussion.
A lot of your colleagues think this is a big gamble, actually, and there's a fair case for that, isn't there? Because let's say you don't get 50% at the election, whichever election you choose, then your opponents say, fine, you've had your second referendum, you've lost 2 in a row, and that's it, done, settled for a good generation, a proper generation. If you do get 50%, they just come along and say, that wasn't a referendum, nobody else recognised that, you're playing games. And they don't, you can't win and you can lose, effectively, is what I'm putting to you.
What you've put to me there in relation to that second scenario would be Westminster intransigence to the people of Scotland voting in a certain way again, which I think is obviously the reason why we're in this position as it stands. But here, all elections are a gamble. When you decide to put forward policies, that's you placing your views in front of the people of Scotland and letting them decide. As I said, I think we need to put hope front and centre. We know that the Westminster parties don't offer us our pathway back to European Union, as 72% of Scots at last count is where they want to be. So we have to be on the front foot here. We have to offer the people of Scotland some hope for a better future. And I think the Westminster general election is a good way to do that.
Here's an unarguable way of doing that. Why don't you just stop playing the system and start doing the politics and start campaigning properly and get your support for independence up to, say, 60% plus for 6 months or more, and get the polls properly shifting. Prove that this is the will, the settled will of the Scottish people. Even Alistair Jack and Michael Gove have said they wouldn't stand in your way if you can do that. Why is that not the route to independence?
I don't think that's quite what Alistair Jack has said. He seems to be completely opposed to any second referendum. I respect.
He says he'll smell it when he knows it, or whatever his quote was.
I mean, whatever nonsense that is. The reality is that the people of Scotland have voted for members of the Scottish Parliament on a pro-independence mandate for a second referendum. The UK government has rejected that. Now, no matter what scenario they try to paint in terms of opinion polls or otherwise, the people of Scotland have already said their view. Independence is a normal thing to seek to achieve for any nation across the world. We seem to be the only ones who have been denied our opportunity. But you're not proving consistently that a significant majority of the people of Scotland support it. That's the point, isn't it? And when you can do that, the argument really settles itself. But I think that would, of course, be helpful. But once we get into that
campaign,
essential, bearing in mind the fact, Martin, that 6 out of 7 last of the most recent opinion polls have showed a majority in favour of Scottish independence. You'll recall in about 2012, I think it was, we were polling around 25% or so in favour of Scottish independence. Now look at it, it's neck and neck, or indeed with us being in the lead. I'm very confident of the fact that when we get into that debate, which we most certainly will, and when we have that clear pathway in terms of where we intend to go, be that a general election or a Scottish parliamentary election, those numbers will increase and we'll win handsomely and make Scotland a positive, vibrant, independent country with a little bit of hope for a better future. Have
you discussed these 2 options that are going to be put to the conference with the First Minister over the weekend?
I wasn't over the weekend, but the First Minister's aware of my views, yeah.
OK, what's your dialogue like with her at the moment? How often do you speak to her?
I have regular contact with the First Minister. I appreciate that certain members of the media and indeed elsewhere are keen to try and stoke it as there's some sort of division between myself and the First Minister, but they're going to have to be sadly disappointed. Well, we're very much aligned and we're in contact quite regularly.
It's just that we were apparently briefed. According to reports, she didn't take to you when you met.
I'm not aware of that. That didn't seem to be
my recollection.
You must have
read the quote. Everybody else has read that quote.
I've actually not read that quote.
Oh, right.
You'll have to forgive me, but no, we had a very cordial meeting and we've had a very cordial couple of discussions since. I'm looking forward, and I've said this repeatedly, the First Minister is an exceptional politician, one of the best in Europe, if not the best. I have a great opportunity to learn from her, and hopefully we can work together to take Scotland to that better future I know we can achieve.
Do you need to get on with her? Is it essential to your ability to do your job, to lead the group in Westminster, that you get on with her and have a good working relationship, or can you do it without that?
I think that most members of the Scottish National Party tend to get on with other members of the Scottish National Party because our views and our values are very much aligned. Like
really?
I say, I've got a positive relationship with the First Minister, and I'm looking forward to building upon that in the months and years to come.
I can think of all sorts of suggestions from within your group at Westminster of people who don't necessarily get on with each other. In fact, is that not the reason you're a leader now, that people were no longer getting on and didn't have faith in Ian Blackford?
No, I think I'm leader of the Scottish National Party at Westminster because we had an annual general meeting, as we do each year. Alison Thulis put herself forward, I put myself forward, and my colleagues voted for me to become the leader.
Yeah,
and
there was all sorts of chicanery going on weeks before that you were going to put yourself up to challenge Ian Blackford, wasn't there? Whatever you suggest, there were games being played in the background, and he was out because we're told he was far too close to the First Minister, and you were somebody who would come along and actually stand up for the group and stand up to her, hold her feet to the fire. Is that not your job?
Well, Martin, I think there's a little bit of garbage in there. Actually, a fair lot of garbage in there. I'll be honest with you. I'm not here to pick fights with the First Minister, and you've probably taken from my answers up to now in relation to the de facto referendum that we appear to be very much aligned on the key issues. Now, that people have obviously tried to project House of Cards onto the SNP Westminster group over the course of the last couple of months, but we're very much focused on what comes next. That fight for Scotland's democracy, that the reality of highlighting the damage being caused to our economy and our public services by Brexit, and of course offering the people what I said earlier, that hope for a better future.
Let me tell you one area where I suspect you are not aligned, and that's in the North Sea. You say the development, for example, of the Cambo oil field can still go ahead. She says it, quote, shouldn't get the green light. Do you agree with the Scottish Government's new energy policy, a presumption against any new oil and gas exploration?
Yes, I do. I've already made this abundantly clear. If we don't need to extract oil and gas, then we shouldn't be extracting oil and gas. The argument and the discussion that is being had in the wider public domain is whether we need that oil and gas. Now, the UK, as it stands, has a climate compatibility checkpoint. That checkpoint was agreed by industry and the UK government as part of the North Sea transition deal. What the Scottish government has rightly sought to do is to strengthen that climate compatibility check and also include the necessity to assess energy security needs.
So no new licences in the North Sea. The presumption, no new licences in the North Sea, which, by the way, has been described by the Grampian Chamber of Commerce as a betrayal and has been met with disbelief, apparently, in the North East. You agree with that? You're on side with that, are you?
Don't put words into my mouth, please, Martin. What I agree with is the fact that we need to ensure that any proposed developments go through a robust climate compatibility checkpoint, which is what the Scottish Government
with a presumption against them.
What is a climate compatibility assessment if it's not a presumption against? It means that industry has to tick the boxes in order to get permission. Now, that climate compatibility check already exists. The Scottish through the UK government. The Scottish government is seeking to make that much tougher. It's something which I support, and it's also rightly seeking to take into account energy security needs, and that's something which I think we're all very mindful of at a time when the likes of Germany are seeking to double down on coal in order to meet their energy demands. We need to be conscious of the environment that we're in, the reality of the fact that the West likes to consume oil and gas, but very much does not like to talk about the fact that they need to shift away from it and as fast as possible.
Okay,
but as part of this, and if you'll forgive me, because we're talking about the Scottish Government's energy security strategy, what we're talking about in real terms here is the fact that Scotland has huge renewables potential, 77,000 jobs potentially by 2050 in onshore wind,
listen,
offshore wind,
we've
tidal,
heard promises of
hydrogen,
renewable jobs many times before. We should be at 120,000 by now, and we're not. But let me just on the issue of that just transition, as it's described, from fossil fuels to renewables, you've said in the past it's possible to pursue just transition without decimating the jobs of thousands of my constituents. Are you softening your line on that now because you've got a big responsible diplomatic job? Do you think any jobs are under threat? Because so many people in your constituency do. In fact, I would suggest to you perhaps your seat's under threat if you don't come down more strongly on this, is it not?
What I'm focused on, and I've been focused on since I entered Parliament, is ensuring that for the medium and long term, which is where we need to be focused in terms of Aberdeen's future, that jobs exist and that those jobs are there in sustainable industries. We know that the North Sea, everyone who works in the North Sea, including members of my own family, know that it is a declining asset. We can't just sit around and wait for that to happen. We need to make sure that that just transition happens, that there's the offshore wind comes to the fore, the onshore wind comes to the fore, that hydrogen comes to the fore, that carbon capture and underground storage and utilisation and storage is delivered. They will offer the jobs, the sustainable jobs for the future, which will ensure that my constituents are able to live the lives that they lead at this moment in time, and hopefully better lives. And that's a good thing for everyone in Aberdeen and the North East.
Before we let you go, Mr Flynn, one of the other big issues at the moment, gender recognition reform. The Scottish Government passed that bill through Holyrood quite easily. The UK Government has until Wednesday to decide whether it is going to block that. How big a moment will it be if they decide to do that?
So there's three things happening in Westminster next week. One is the presumption that the UK government is going to rail against the democratic view of the Scottish Parliament across party. Obviously, that was not just the Scottish National Party, it was Labour politicians, Conservative politicians, Lib Dem politicians and Green politicians all in favour of the GRR. So that's one thing that the UK Parliament is going, or the UK government is presuming to go against. Then we have the strike legislation on Monday, which will be against the Scottish Parliament's will, and of course the legislation on Wednesday to rip up workers' rights in relation to the EU retained law bill, which will put under threat our standards.
Yeah, but let me pull you back to GRR. If the lawyers, Mr. Flynn, if the UK government's lawyers tell them that you have passed a bill that would have a material impact on the way the law works out with Scotland, across the rest of the UK, is it not reasonable for them to say, you've overstepped the mark here, you've got to come and talk to us about amending this?
No, it's not reasonable at all in any way, shape or form.
Why, if you're impacting UK law?
Because it is a devolved matter for the Scottish Parliament
that could have an impact beyond Scotland.
And the Scottish Parliament has determined its position. We elect members to the Scottish Parliament to create legislation, to put in place the laws, to enhance the lives of people in Scotland. The GRR is going to do just that.
And people out with Scotland, should they?
What we have is a right-wing UK Conservative government which is seeking to roll back on the democratic powers of the Scottish Parliament. That's an outrage. And the people that should be most outraged about that are the likes of the Conservative and Labour politicians who voted in favour of the GRR, who must recognise the fact that this is the UK Parliament overstepping massively.
But if they come back and say, listen, we're not asking you to kill your bill, we're just saying talk to us about amending it so it doesn't impact people who don't live in Scotland, is that really that unreasonable?
I'm sorry, but have we not seen the comments coming from senior members of the UK government in relation to GRR? Their issue is not in relation...
But legally, is it unreasonable for them to do that?
Sorry, but their issue is not in relation to the fact that it's been passed by the Scottish Parliament. Their issue is a policy issue that they seek to disagree with it. The reality here is the Scottish Parliament has voted for something that should happen under the devolution settlement, and if the UK Parliament goes against that, just as it will next week in relation to Scotland's views on the anti-strike legislation and the EU bonfire legislation on Wednesday, then that's a democratic disgrace, and it's another case, quite frankly, for Scottish independence.
Yeah, I mean, listen, whether this is coincidence or not, it's quite useful politically to your cause, all this. Going back to what we were discussing at the top, a clash between two parliaments does nothing to hamper the push for independence, right?
I would prefer there was no clash on this issue, because we're talking about some of the most marginalised and vulnerable people in society, and they're my focus, not the clash between the two parliaments, I'm afraid.
All right, fair point, well made. Stephen Flynn, many thanks indeed for your time this morning on the Sunday Show.
Cheers, Martin, thank you.
Stephen Flynn speaking to me just a few minutes before we came on air, and as Mr. Flynn was saying there, one of the other big issues dominating our politics at the moment is industrial unrest, strikes, basically. It feels like they're impacting virtually every aspect of our lives at the moment, doesn't it? And while negotiations continue in many areas, there's no obvious end in sight. Well, in a moment, we're going to discuss the impact the teachers' strikes are having on pupils and their parents with Andrea Bradley, the leader of the Teachers' Union, the biggest teachers' union in Scotland, the EIS. But first, let's find out how the public are feeling just now. Mark Diffley is the director of the polling and research group, the Diffley Partnership. He joins me now from Edinburgh. Morning to you, Mark.
Morning, Martin.
Thanks for being with us. Right, listen, just before we get on to strikes, let me just quickly go back to independence. We were discussing it at length with Stephen Flynn there. Just bring us up to speed. Where are we in terms of public mood on independence?
Well, as Stephen Flynn quite rightly said there, the last 6 of the last 7 opinion polls have shown support for independence outstripping support for the union by relatively small margins. I think the big picture is we're still at around 50-50. The issue that you touched on with him there about this issue of a de facto referendum and which election, whether it's the general election or the Holyrood election that the party chooses, I think is really important because the majority of voters don't think using the next general election as a de facto referendum is a good idea. So in terms of the next steps towards a referendum, or how you fight the next election, I think this is going to be a really, really important decision that the party has to make.
On more immediate matters, Mark, then strikes. Broad support across the board for striking workers towards the end of last year. Any change in that?
No, not really. I think that we're still in a position where the vast majority of the public believe in the right to strike. That's really important, I think, given the legislation that the UK government is bringing in. So in Scotland and actually across the UK, there is still there is still really strong support for the right to strike. And when we get into the specifics around the industrial action that's happening at the moment, the latest readout from polls in Scotland, which is from a Savanta poll for the Scotsman, right at the end of 2022, so really quite up to date, is that about 2/3 of us support nurses going on strike. Slightly less support for teachers, although it's still the majority, 57%. And for doctors 56% as well. So these kind of key public services and public sector strikes that are going on at the moment do still have majority support with the public. What we do see when we take a step back, so if we look at GB-wide polling for a moment, we have seen some tail off in support for strikes. So if you look at how support for strikes looked in September of last year and you compare it to December for all of the key public bodies, that includes nurses, includes teachers and other health workers, ambulance drivers and so forth, there is still majority support, but it has tailed off since the autumn. So now the key thing now in my world, at least in the world of public opinion, is whether that continues to tail off or whether we continue, or most of us continue to support industrial action.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Well, let's take some of that then, shall we? And put it to Andrea Bradley of the EIS. Before we do that, let me just remind you of the hashtag on social media. It's BBC Sunday Show. Let us know what you make of all that. We're keen to hear from you. Right, here is Andrea Bradley. Morning to you, Andrea. Right, Mark's statistics there. Quite interesting. 2/3 of the public support nurses, 57% support teachers. It's tailing off a little bit. Are you concerned about that? You still think you've got the public behind you?
So that's UK-wide data. What we're seeing from picket lines is very strong levels of support from parents and other members of the public. Just this week, the national...
From picket lines, what, anecdotally? People hooting their horns as they go past, or do you have anything more scientific than that?
People hooting their horns as they go past, stopping to talk, stopping to take leaflets from the picketers and so on.
Right.
But also this week, the National Parent Forum of Scotland published data from 2 surveys that they had run recently, showing that more than 80% of their members support teachers and support teachers in their pursuit of fair pay. OK. Any end in sight to all of this, or are we still stuck down at the kind of bottom of a trench in terms of negotiations? Is there any cause for optimism here? I wouldn't say that we're stuck down at the bottom of a trench, because there's still willingness on all sides to get round the negotiating table to talk. So that's something at least. But in terms of an end in sight, I think that we're still quite a bit away from that, because there aren't figures on the table as yet that we can meaningfully work with, to see a way through this dispute. So there's a bit more work to be done on the part of COSLA and the Scottish Government to get us there. Well, it sounds it. I mean, we're hearing from the government, you've been made what was the best and final offer that you're going to get. It's fair and affordable, according to Shirley Ann Somerville, and your demands are simply unaffordable. They don't have the money on a fixed budget, they say, to give you what you're asking for. It's pretty definitive language, isn't it? They're telling you there's just no more money for you. So what happens now? How long does this go on? So the offer that came in November was practically the same offer as had come in August, and it actually wasn't badged as a last and final offer. It has been badged as fair and affordable by the Scottish Government in terms of what is fair and affordable to them, but we've been absolutely clear throughout this process so far that 5% offer is neither fair nor affordable for our members. It would represent a 21.8% increase in teachers' pay since 2018. But you're holding out for more. You're holding out for double what they're offering you. If teachers were to accept the 5% that was on the table, that figure is correct. However, it does not take account of the fact that the pay of teachers has eroded to the tune of 20 to 25% overall since 2008. So it's a very selective set of figures that are being, bandied around the media and in the Scottish Parliament. It's not the full story. Yeah, I mean, so you've got slim majority public support on this. There will still be a large rump of viewers and listeners across this programme this morning thinking, hang on a minute, I'm taking, you're striking two councils every day for the next 16 days across the country. People taking unpaid days off work, time they can ill afford to take off to look after their kids, thinking, I'm not getting anything like a 10% increase. I'm not getting anything like a teacher's pay. They're getting paid more than teachers elsewhere in the UK, more than they get paid in many other countries. What do you say to those people who don't have sympathy? So I think maybe
Why should they have sympathy with you?
I think to start at the end there, it's not accurate to say that teachers are paid more than teachers elsewhere in the UK. Starting salaries are better, but when you look at the salaries of experienced teachers across the UK, Scotland doesn't compare favourably. And the same is true of the OECD, where there are 14 countries ahead of Scotland. When you get to the upper ends of the career ladder, it doesn't compare favourably for Scotland. In terms of why we think that the public do sympathise and should sympathise, it's because of the absolutely essential work that teachers do with children and young people in classrooms every day, where incidentally they would much rather be than on picket lines, and the value that they bring to school communities and to our whole society. From the data that the National Parent Forums shared,
for 2 years as well. I mean, that comes into...
Absolutely. The last thing that teachers want is for children's education to be disrupted.
Which
That's
it is
the last
being
thing.
now.
Which it is being, but the responsibility for that rests with the Scottish Government and COSLA, who have had a year actually to bring forward a resolution that would have teachers in classrooms rather than on picket lines, and sadly they have not done that.
Are they negotiating in good faith? Are they trying as hard as they possibly can, do you think, to resolve this?
Thus far, I don't think so. I think that there have been some meaningful negotiations. Lots of solutions and suggestions came from us early on in this process, which have not been taken seriously up until this point. Hopefully, in the weeks, days and weeks ahead, we can start to really get into some of the detail of the suggestions that we have previously made.
Some of your members reckon that the government and COSLA are putting more energy, more effort into solving the dispute with the nurses, for example, than they are into solving the dispute with the teachers. Would you agree with that? Is that your sense?
So we're not really in the business of comparing ourselves to other groups of workers. We wish every group of worker who is in pursuit of fair pay all the very best, and we stand in solidarity with them.
But you can still have an opinion on whether they're trying harder, they're paying more attention to the nurses than you.
What we would say is that with the resource that the Scottish Government has, they should be able to attend to both sets of needs, to the needs of both sets of workers. And we hope that in the coming days and weeks there is going to be the urgency shown to settle the teachers' dispute, as has been shown more recently to settle the dispute within the NHS.
Obvious question, are you willing to compromise? I mean, will you come down from 10%?
Every negotiation has an element of compromise within it. Every negotiation has an element of compromise within it.
The time's ticking a little bit on this as well, isn't it? Because inflation is going to go down. Well, most economists project that. Later in the year, if you're demanding 10% because inflation's somewhere around 10, 11%. If inflation goes down to 7%, do you then just demand 7%? Because that could represent a huge saving for the government in the future.
So this pay claim was submitted on the 7th of February 2022, when inflation was running at 7%. So there was a 3% element of the claim at that time, which was restorative, and that was in recognition of the fact that teachers' salaries have eroded in real terms by 20 to 25%.
So it stays at 10% even if inflation comes down to 5-6%?
The claim for this year stays at 10%.
Okay. Andrea Bradley, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. We will watch this closely and I'm sure be speaking to you again in the near future. In the meantime, that is it from me for this week. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. If you've been watching us on the telly this morning, thanks for your company. I will be back as ever, same time, same place here on BBC One, 10 o'clock next week. If you're listening on the radio, the Sunday show continues as ever right through to midday. And here to take you there is Fiona Stocker.
The new holiday season is sure to make a big splash.
Everyone will be all hands on deck.
This board first, Mark. We got there in the end, like we always do.
Returning for a new series.
Absolutely.